Welcome to the Whiskey Vault. I'm Daniel Whittington, Chancellor of Wizard Academy and Whiskey Marketing School. We're going to talk double versus triple distillation. This was a question asked by Stephen Curtin in the Facebook group and by a couple other people in the YouTube channel. So I'm like, you know what? Fine, we'll talk about this. Now, this is something that only applies to pot distillation, pot still batch distillation. Historically, distillation in the UK and Ireland was double distillation. So you take your beer, you put it in a pot, you heat it all the way up, and you start evaporating things out, and you strip as much alcohol as you possibly can. You take what's left in that tank all the way down to single-digit ABV. And you keep everything, no cuts, no nothing. That's called the stripping run. In double distillation, the next run, you proof it down to sort of open it back up again, and then you turn it on and start distilling, and now you make heads, hearts, and tails cuts, and you keep the heart, and that's called the spirit run. There's a whole video about this you can watch on the channel. But that's double distillation. First run strips all the alcohol out of the beer that it can. Second run refines the spirit to be put into a barrel. Now, triple distillation was less common, and it showed up way later in the game, and it showed up for a couple of reasons. It showed up in Ireland, but Ireland's not the only one who does it. It showed up in Ireland historically because there was a combination of a more refined, lighter spirit, and also, just a style guide to sort of help refine and clean it up. So one, it created a flavor profile that we're going for, but two, it sort of cleaned up this funkier, faultier mash bill that Ireland was often using. And, you know, it was half a dozen to one, etc. And that created this sort of standard style of triple distillation Irish whiskey, so standard that the majority of the distilleries were doing it at a certain point in history. Actually, like 20 out of 28 at one point, I think. And it became famous to the point where you will hear people say, all Irish whiskey's triple distilled. That's what makes Irish whiskey Irish whiskey. It's like, well, no. but I get what you're going for, right? It is way more common in Ireland than it is anywhere else. Now, in a triple distillation, first let me say, there are Scottish distilleries that triple distill. I mean, Auchentoshan. Oh, what's another one? There was another one that I had right off the top of my head, and I can't think of who it was. Rosebank and Hazelburn. That's what it was, Hazelburn. At the Springbank Distillery, they've got 3 lines, Long Row, Springbank, and Hazelburn. Hazelburn's triple distilled. And so there are other distilleries, and in America, there are people who are sort of modeling Irish-style whiskey that are doing triple distillation. So what happens in triple distillation? Well, you take your stripping run and you do a stripping run on a pot still. You get all the alcohol you can, you put it into the next tank. Proof it down a little bit and you start running it. Then you sort of make some cuts. You don't make cuts as narrow as you would if it was going into the barrel, but you make cuts that you don't make on the stripping run, right? So think of it as a really wide cut, and your really, really high feints get rerouted back into another distillation, or high heads, and then your low feints get rerouted back into another distillation and run again later, and you keep this super wide heart, and it goes into the third pot, and then on the third pot, you do your typical spirit run with cuts and heart, and then the leavings of those go back into other distillations, right? So it's almost like stripping run, wide cut, narrow cut, and that is a massive oversimplification, but just for your understanding, it's not stripping run, cut. Now, because you have cut the spirit a couple times and refined it through distillation and you get more interaction with copper and more reflux and all of these things, it strips things out of the final spirit. We'll talk about that in a second, but first we're going to talk about the double pot distilled Port Charlotte heavily peeled. This is a Bruichladdich whiskey, and it's one of my favorites. This is their 10-year-old heavily peated Islay single malt. What I love about this one, in addition to the bottle being awesome, is This was a marker of Bruichladdich attempt to make the most Islay whiskey it could make. And so they were aiming for 100% Islay barley. I think the more recent ones are. 100% Scottish barley from Inverness. They were trying to get more and more barley from actual Islay, but there's only a certain amount of that. It's heavily peated. This is first fill American casks, second fill American casks, and second fill French oak wine casks. They even wanted it to age. So the Port Charlotte barrels are aged on Islay. So they, as much as possible, Scottish barley, and then Islay aged, and then some Islay barrel. And Kilchoman has 100% Islay on a couple releases, but it's very small scale. So it's interesting because the part per million on this one is 40 on the, and it puts it lower than Octomore, but not by a ton. And I think it is a very balanced smoky Islay. It is very fruit and vanilla fruit cup forward. A lot of American oak in there, right? So think of like your peaches and apricots and pear type fruits, drenched in honey, sweetness, and then coated in a charred, blackened smoke layer, almost like the outside of a marshmallow, like burnt to a crisp on the outside. The smoke is heavy, but it's not quite salty or briny in the direction that like a Laphroaig is, or even Caol Ila. It's heavier than that, but I think that's coming from the fruitiness of the barley and the fermentations. I just splashed whiskey into my eyeball. Well, that'll clear things up, or not. Whew. See, on the palate, that smoke softens into a supporting cast member. This is why I love this whiskey. Because the smoke on Port Charlotte heavily peated is a base supporting structure as opposed to this massive layer that coats everything on top. And so all the real flavor in Port Charlotte lives in the mid palate and in the highs, all these fruity esters and things like that. And then the smoke just becomes this weighty base layer that's holding everything together. But for a 50% whiskey, 100 proof, it's so soft. Now, keep in mind, you have to like smoky whiskey. All these things I'm saying, don't mistake this for Glenfarclas or a slight softer, Balvenie or something. Like, this is the definite smoky whiskey, absolute no question. Mike, who's shooting, can probably smell it from over there. Smell the smoke? But if you're used to smoky whiskey, it's got all of these nice desserty notes that I really love. The aftertaste is very much smoky aftertaste. Okay, double pot distillation, a lot of things. So when you do a triple distillation, you're increasing rectification and copper contact and reflux, right? That greater concentrates certain flavor compounds that result in these like lighter, aromatic, slightly delicate fruit, citrusy, clean. Those are the big heavy things, the oils and things are water soluble. And so it softens these things, and that gives you this sort of trademark light touch to the whiskey. If you've ever had Auchentoshan, then you know that this single malt Scotch is kind of light, grassy, citrusy, right? That's one of the things that you're getting from a triple distillation. You do a double distillation, you're holding in more of the weightier compounds that sort of provide all of these base structure. And so it gets denser and more oily and heavier. And so, yeah, does that lead to the trademark Irish light and accessible? Definitely contributes, no question. So I think the conclusion on that is, if you triple distill, is it lighter? Yes, chemically speaking. Is it smoother? Maybe. Does it have less congeners and compounds? Yes. Is it less harsh? Maybe. So there are scientific things that are accurate that it does create, but I've had double pot distillation that was softer and more gentler than a triple, and I've had a triple that was light and effervescent and delicate like cut glass. And it still has to do with what you do next. It's just a decision. It's also expensive. Every time you do another distillation, you lose things. Now, on a small side note that I'm not going to get into right now, there are some people who try to say things like, we distilled this thing 12 times. They're never talking about whiskey. They're usually talking about gin or vodka, right? Do they mean that they distilled the spirit through 12 different stills? No. What they mean is they had a column still with 12 plates in it. And they're counting every plate as its own separate distillation, which I would argue is at best a half-truth. But that's a different topic for a different time. Cheers to you. I'm really glad you're here. This video is triple distilled by only the best hands, Mike's hands. Is it triple distilled if I spoke, you filmed, and then you edited? Does that make a triple distillation? All right. Welcome to a triple distilled whiskey YouTube channel. Like and subscribe.